Mauri oho, Mauri tū, Mauri ora ki a tātou, haumie huie tae ki e. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki te Māori and Antarctica ka mua ka muri seminar series. I won't go into too much detail in the fronting because the presentation will give you a really detailed description of what the seminar series is all about. But I might just kick over to Scylla to sort of introduce the kaupapa for this session.
So kia ora tātou, thank you everybody for coming along to our final seminar for the week. And just a reminder, we hope that you've enjoyed it. You can watch anything that you've missed online. And we really look forward to seeing you back with whakaaro and an opportunity to speak on August the 12th. So that's our online wānanga. You know, we've come quite a long way since we started this kaupapa. So our kaupapa has been linked from the start of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area in December 2017. And so we started growing our team from 2018. So it began with me, and then Billy came on board last year, which was pretty exciting, bringing all of his expertise from working with MOB in Australia on water rights and water policy and governance. We've also got Krisha Watene, who you heard from before, who's again been a vital part of our team, bringing that philosophy but also helping to ground us. And the latest member of our team is Isabella Sullivan, who's here. She's based in Alaska though. She's grown up in an Alaskan community, and so although she won't be speaking today, she's online. You can ask her questions. There are things that she might bring some beautiful insights to, just based on her experience of living in an Indigenous community in the Arctic, and based on her study as well in marine research at Stanford. So, you know, it's really exciting to see how this kaupapa has been developing. And we think with your input, we'll be able to really start thinking about some great directions for the future, because this is what it's all about. Where do we go from here? So I'm going to hand over to Billy now for this last seminar. And we're really starting to think in this seminar about Antarctic policy and governance in Aotearoa and globally, and what does that look like and what could it look like. So kia ora, Billy.
Kia ora, Scylla. I just wanted to give Bella, did you want to take the opportunity to just introduce yourself? And then we'll kick into the presentation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Billy. Sat Nizun, Isabella Sullivan Utsa, Milio Adjecta Uten Ashlen, Rampart Utsen Sedenslet Yet Anchorage Lesdo, Ina A. Julie Fate Sullivan Utsa, Sitsu Jane Fate Utsa. Hi, my name is Isabella Fate Sullivan. I'm Koikon Athabaskan, so my family is from the middle section of the Yukon River in interior Alaska. My grandma was from a native village on the Yukon River called Rampart, where my family returns to our ancestor lands every summer for the salmon run. But I currently live in Anchorage right now. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate at Stanford University studying ocean and climate science, and my major interests have revolved around climate change communication and implementing Indigenous advocacy in environmental issues and research, which is why I joined this team as a research intern. My main purpose on this team is to give insight into Indigenous matters in Arctic policy. Some broad topics I'm researching include how is traditional knowledge involved in Arctic research and governance across different Arctic nations? How has the rise of Indigenous voices in Arctic policy in the 8 Arctic countries occurred throughout history? And how can we think about connection to place in the Arctic in a way that transcends international boundaries and the more common Western thinking? I'm very excited to be working in this team, creating international Indigenous relationships, and look forward to the conversations that will follow this seminar series. Anapasi.
Kia ora, Bella. Thank you for that, and it's really cool to have you on the team. I did want to start by acknowledging you and welcoming you to the team. It's been about 2 weeks you've been back on board from the salmon run, and I know you're sort of hitting the ground running in terms, and you're reading really broadly. But I guess so. I met you for the first time about a year ago for 2 weeks camping out in the bush in Aussie, and I think one of my favourite moments from that. So you were on a semester abroad with Stanford University. And one of my favourite moments from this year, from last year, was our little yarn on our walk back from the Billabong, and you got to yarning about your Nan's experience and involvement in building Indigenous knowledges into Arctic science and policy. And I think that was, yeah, quite one of those eye-opening moments, and it feels really good to have you as part of the team. It feels like a natural fit, and is definitely reflective of those sort of global connections, or global connectedness that we're thinking about in this kaupapa. I say welcome to the team, bud. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Aotea te waka, ko Taranaki te maunga, ko Wanganui te awa, ko Ngārauru te iwi, ko Pākaraka te marae, ko Mozi ahau, ko Billy van Uitregt tōku ingoa. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. So I guess that's my pepeha, but I need to probably give you a bit more information about who I am to see where I'm coming from in terms of this kaupapa, like where my approach comes from. So I have Ngārauru, Tūhoi and Dutch whakapapa, but I was born and raised on Jagera and Turrbal country in southeast Queensland, so in Brisbane and Logan, if you know those places. And I've always loved animals, and I wanted to be a vet, but I didn't have the grades. So I ended up being a zoologist instead, and took that to the point where I did my PhD in evolutionary ecology in 2012. I finished that. Now, all of that work, all of that research was really centered on animal physiology, and in particular how temperature influences the organisms and their role within predator-prey systems. So it's quite distinct to what I do now. I took way too long to do my PhD, and I needed to earn some cash. So I started working for my supervisor in building a research partnership with the Antarctic Land and Sea Rangers and their countries up on Groote Island in the Northern Territory and in the Gulf of Carpentaria, but on the Northern Territory side. And I think, well, it didn't take too long for me to jump ship from the university and start working for that mob in their own organisations. And in my time there, I was there for about 2 years. There's two big lessons that I took away from it. And the first was that my education as an ecologist was no near a match to the wisdom and knowledge of country that these fellows sort of had innately just through their way of viewing the world. And then the second was that when we do try and build these partnerships between Western scientific institutions like universities and Indigenous peoples, that we really need to be mindful that there's equity when you're building those partnerships. So when I jumped out of the university and into the Indigenous organisation, I think you really get a flip side perspective on what the structures of those relationships look like and the power dynamics that sit within them, sorry. So that was it for me. I jumped ship for science, and I looked around Aussie for jobs where I could work with First Nations people on these environmental issues. And I ended up in an amazing role living on Kaurna country in Adelaide in South Australia and working with First Nations along Murundi, so Nunga mob down that way. And so Murundi is the River Murray. And that's in South Australia. And I was working for government. I need to put that out there. And engaging with First Nations to try and build their perspectives and worldviews into water policy and planning for the state. And again, you know, those two lessons that I took away from working with Wanandiakwa, they just kept getting reaffirmed. So that first one, that you know, getting exposure to this different way of relating to and understanding the natural environment and association to place, particularly the River Murray, was just reinforced that different way to view things. And probably most importantly, so I was working for government for about 6 years. One of the most important lessons I take away from that time was the real need to make sure that when we do build partnerships between Indigenous groups and government organisations and scientists and policy and governance people, we need to make sure that there's equity in the conversation. So now I finished up in that role about just over a year ago, and I've come to live life in Aotearoa. For the main reason is to connect with the wairoa of my late mum, and to build a Māoritanga for myself, which is something that I feel is sort of, you know, there's a bit of a gap since mum's passing. So that's the main reason. So I moved to Dunedin in the first instance to do my Masters of Indigenous Studies at Tutamu. So kia ora to to Lynn Carter, my supervisor. I didn't see you register, but I hope you watch it back later. Yeah, and to support myself while I was doing that study, I was just looking for casual work, but I ended up finding Scylla and Crucial. And there's certainly nothing casual about the work we've been doing. And I jumped on board this kaupapa, and a year later, we're running this sort of seminar series. Yeah, so it's been a big year, incredibly fruitful. And just before COVID sort of hit us, I scored a new job here at Te Herenga Waka at Victoria University of Wellington as a lecturer in environmental studies. And I guess my research interests and my teaching interests are really all centered around when we're trying to bring these two worldviews together, trying to make sure that we're doing it with some sort of equity. So I just talked explicitly about my personal experience with being on both sides of those coins. You really get to see the power dynamics that exist within those structures, or those partnerships, I should call them. And that's exactly what's attracted me to this kaupapa in the first place. I see it as a continuation of the kinds of work I've been doing, but perhaps we're just upscaling our thinking a little bit in terms of geographical area, given that we're thinking about Antarctica. So I might kick into my presentation now. Oh, now I can't see you guys. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so I think, you know, we're thinking about how do we build equity in this conversation between Te Ao Māori and Western science. And I think that's really evident in the way that Scylla, Te Warahi, Fane, Potes and James, in the work that they did to frame this kaupapa with Te Whakairo. And it's a perfect way to make sure that there's an equitable conversation, that this Māori form of knowledge and expression of knowledge is given equity in the conversation. So I think that's one of the fundamental things that really attracted to me. It was like, okay, we're having a conversation about on equal terms, and that's really, really important. And I hope you can see that we're trying to continue that theme of, you know, having this conversation on equal terms through this seminar series more broadly. And I guess I like to think about it as trying to build this concept of two-eyed seeing, where having the ability to view and understand something through, you know, two different perspectives or two worldviews allows us a deeper appreciation of the thing that we're viewing at, just like, you know, we have two eyes gives us three-dimensional vision. But we need to make sure that when we're looking through these two worldviews that we have this sort of 2020 approach to it. Yeah. So I was very deliberate yesterday, actually, in thanking Matt for his support of the project and our approach to it. And that was because I'm sure it's probably a little bit anxiety inducing for him to have for a Ross Sea region, a Ross Sea research and monitoring program, to have a vision mātauranga element or branch of the research that's far broader than just the Ross Sea. And I think that's something that's been really fundamental, that if we started to have a conversation with Hapu and Iwi about, well, what are your aspirations for involvement in the Ross Sea? I mean, Dan Hikuroa's yarn yesterday or the day before, I'm not too sure which point he said it. The problem with protected areas is that no one tells the animals where the boundaries are. And that's a little bit more reflective of this Indigenous worldview of connectedness that I think Crucial touched on really, really nicely in her presentation. And it's incredibly important then that when we do have this conversation, that we don't have these, I guess, funding structures that mean that the conversation's constrained with these boundaries that don't necessarily allow Hapu and Iwi to engage in the kaupapa in a meaningful way. So that's explicitly what we've done. We've opened it up. We've got all of these different seminars, which might reflect different approaches for Hapu and Iwi to jump on board this kaupapa and to stimulate that broader thinking. So that was a very deliberate approach that we've taken. Now, the next way that we've tried to build equity in the conversation is to frame it quite explicitly within this Māori concept of kamua kamuri, or walking backwards into the future. And that's the purpose of this seminar series and this wānanga, or the wānanga to come. We needed to build a space that allows Hapu and Iwi to get informed and reflect on our history of connection to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, to be able to think about what we want them to look like in the future, and given those aspirations, what we need to be doing now to achieve them. And so I hope that's really evident within the seminar series, and that it emboldens Hapua Niue to jump into the kaupapa and to set those aspirations for where we want to be, as well as how we need to get there. So I think I can, cool, I'm moving along. And that's what I've tried to depict in this image. I want to be upfront. I think I've tried this out with a few people. Not too many people engage with it too meaningfully. What I've tried to capture there is this concept of whakapapa. So whakapapa is this layering of narratives of connection that sort of give us a foundation for what we want to do in the future. So I think, in terms of our first narrative of connection to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, we have these whales and other migratory tonga species that give this really explicit link between Māori and Antarctic land and seascapes. I think Dan's kōrero the other day, made me think about maybe we've got another layer of connection that we need to make sure we're conceptualizing, and that sort of, the deep geological past, that connection between Antarctica and Aotearoa. So Whaia Sandy Morrison talked about voyaging, Hui Te Rangiora and other tupuna to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. We've had this really explicit Māori participation in the heroic age and in the heroic age and the more contemporary exploration. Then we've had amazing kōrero in this seminar series about how Māori scientists are participating quite heavily in the scientific effort in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And Jack's kōrero the other day really highlighted that Māori are participating on the fishing boats, and I think Whaia Sandy confirmed that again today. And then these more recent narratives of these really explicitly Māori expressions of connection to Antarctica, and Te Whakairo being one of the most recent ones, or the most recent one. So hopefully you can see that this sort of structure creates, we're layering these narratives, and it creates a platform that we hope, it creates a platform for Hapua Niue to then go, okay, well, based on our connections, our history of connection to Antarctica, what do we want our future to look like? What are our aspirations for connection? And then what do we need to be doing now to be able to achieve those aspirations? And I just probably point out that there's a bit of a feedback loop between these two questions. So as time goes on, we can readjust our aspirations and obviously readjust what we need to be doing right now to be able to achieve them. So we're in the middle of that work right now. There's no final report to show to everybody. We're doing this right now. And the way that we want to do it is to make sure that when we're engaging with Hapua Niue, that it's a really informed conversation. So we didn't just want to rock up and say, okay, well, what are your aspirations for involvement or voice and representation in Antarctic science policy and governance? It's going to be a fairly short conversation. So what we've tried to do is create this seminar series so that we can inform people, they can have an informed conversation, have a wānanga in a couple of weeks' time to make sure that it's a two-way conversation, it's not just us talking at you. And then we'll follow that up with a survey to really allow Hapua Niue to articulate what their aspirations are and how they think what we think we need to be doing to get there. And then we did plan to report back in November. I guess I'd probably just point out that it's a bit of a moving beast. We need to be responsive. The response from Māori has been really strong, and equally the response from the Antarctic researchers and scientists has been really strong as well. So I guess we need to be responsive to that thing that we didn't really plan on. We're really trying to target Hapua Niue to set those aspirations, but recognizing that there's probably two conversations going on. So we need to be responsive, and we're thinking about how we sort of structure a wānanga for Antarctic researchers and scientists going forward. And also we just need to be responsive to what Hapua Niue are sort of saying. So we've had some comments, some people are going, yeah, I want to take that to my Hapua meeting and my iwi meetings. And hopefully that's the intent, that everybody jumps on board with that and engages with the website to do so. and then comes back for wānanga to have a good conversation. And then we can jump on board that survey process. And again, the survey will be responsive to what comes out of the seminar series and the wānanga as well. Cool. So while we're doing that work, there's a few bits and pieces that we can be doing to support it as well, that we probably really need to be doing so that the conversation is really well informed. And this is probably one of the most fundamental things that I've sort of directed my time towards. And Jack touched on it really poignantly at the end of his conversation, or his presentation, sorry. And he showed that map. So it was like his mind map of how Antarctic, or New Zealand's Antarctic and Southern Ocean fishing works, right? And he put up that question mark, well, where's the Māori voice amongst it all? So that was a really good lead into this sort of map. I would point out too that if you were at the UC Gateway Antarctica conference earlier this year, you would have seen Adrian McDonald put up a map, like it was basically his mind map of how New Zealand's Antarctic science works. And it was quite similar to Jack's, so like little circles here, there and everywhere, and there's lots of overlap, just reflecting the complexity of these, the policy and governance structures that exist around this for the science in Antarctica. So here you're getting a glimpse into my head as to what I think Antarctic science policy and governance looks like. I'm not necessarily too focused on the science side of things. I'm really focused on the governance and the policy. So I didn't just pull this out of my head. Last year I got to be part of the New Zealand's CAMLAR delegation, so that was really informative. So I guess my perspective is probably more well-formed around CAMLAR. But having that sort of basis allowed me to build those relationships with the people who do know what's going on, to be able to build this bigger picture and test it out with them. And I've done that with a few people from Antarctica, New Zealand, a few people from Manaaki Whenua, particularly who are associated with the Antarctic Science Platform. And then Jack's had a kōrero with me about this. And I've presented it at the the Ross Ramp user group, sorry. And got some feedback through that process as well. So while it is representative of what I think it looks like, it's still well informed. I guess I'd also point out that for these sorts of structures, the reality is far more complex than what you can put down on a piece of paper. So there's probably lines going here, there and everywhere. But I think we don't want the complexity of the situation to kind of stall the conversation. If we are able to lay out a map like this, we can start to think about, okay, well, where is the Māori voice built into this structure? And probably more importantly, where can the Māori voice be enhanced within this structure? So just to go through this briefly, if you do want to engage in the detail of this, please go to the website. In the background information tab, we've got links going here, there and everywhere to really give you a good smattering of the detail. Here is a very high level overview. Okay, so at the international level, we have the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, and that's constituted under the Antarctic Treaty. Within the Antarctic Treaty, we have the Environmental Protection Protocol. And under that, they established a Committee for the Environmental Protections, the CEP. So that's ATCM, ATCM and CEP. And they're very closely linked to each other. They basically happen at the same time. And the delegates from each are pretty much the same people almost. Just sitting outside of the Antarctic Treaty, but still part of the Antarctic Treaty system is the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, so CAMLAR. And under CAMLAR is established CAMLAR, or the Commission for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So a bit confusing with the acronyms there. And this sort of structure is pretty complicated. There's lots of networks internationally with lots of different nations. And I think I just tried to reflect that here. So CAMLAR and international networks, it's really complex. And all of this work is supported by a Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, so SCAR. And I believe that meeting is happening right now, or the conference is happening right now. Okay, so that's the international level. When we're looking at the national level, so New Zealand is party to the Antarctic Treaty and to CAMLAR. So makes delegations, has delegations that go to the meetings and make representations on behalf of New Zealand. All right, so focusing on the New Zealand CAMLAR delegation, it's led by MFAT, the lead agency. It includes MPI for the fisheries and compliance that goes on, so what Jack talked about. DOC are represented in terms of the MPA management, so what Matt talked about. And then fisheries rep, going back to Jack. So Jack's always on CAMLAR as part of the New Zealand delegation. That's where we first met. All right, so that sits under CAMLAR. And it's distinct, but the people sort of overlap quite heavily. We've got the New Zealand delegation for the ATCM and CEP. And again, MFAT is the lead agency, and Antarctica and New Zealand play a very strong role in that. Obviously, the delegation's is broader than that as well. All right, so I've put this little block here just to kind of represent that national interest from outside of government are also represented, so environmental groups, etc. And basically, I just wanted to make the point that anyone can write a letter to any of the ministers and make some sort of representation in there. All right, so within the nation, there are a couple of governance groups that are already established and operate. So we've got the CAMLAR stakeholder group, feeds directly into there. The CEP stakeholder group feeds directly into there. There's lots of overlap between these groups as well in terms of people and representation. Just point out that the Ross Ramp user group is chaired by Matt, is very, very clearly directed at Ross Ramp and managing that project and being responsive out of it. And then the Antarctic Working Group is very much, I'm pretty sure it's led by MPI, but I probably have to check that, sorry. All right, so they're the established governance groups. There's obviously more things going on there, but I've just simplified for the benefit of our conversation. And probably really important to note is the New Zealand Royal Society National Committee in Antarctic Sciences is really prominent, and that's sort of our direct link into SCAR. The Antarctic Science Platform is this enormous beast from what I can tell. And if you want to engage with that, please go to the website. My description of it wouldn't go nowhere near to doing it justice. And then we have this broad smattering of New Zealand's research institutions that have some sort of association with Antarctica, and the funding agencies involved with that. I guess I'd probably just point out too that Antarctica and New Zealand is really fundamental in these conversations because they manage the logistics for basically getting to and being on Antarctica. So it's one of the constraints that really does confine what science does go on. And I think, you know, everyone would be feeling that very much so right now. All right, so that's the sort of governance stuff that sits out there. And it's a very brief overview. I'm not the expert, but it's what I can sort of take out of it all. In terms of policy, now that's where I really want to focus in on. So at the highest level for the nation, we've got these two documents here, again, linked to the website. You've got New Zealand's Statement of Commitment to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, really high level document, and then New Zealand's Statement of Strategic Interest in Antarctica. Now, please go to the website to engage with those. I think the point that I would make out of them is that they're the highest level sort of policy document in terms of guiding how New Zealand makes representations in Antarctica. But none of those reference Tau Māori or Te Tiriti obligations or anything like that. Now coming down here, Antarctica and New Zealand, they have carriage, I guess I would say, of a couple of policy documents. I'd start with this one. It's led by MFAT more so, but sort of administered by Antarctica and New Zealand. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. And that's a New Zealand, Antarctic and Southern Ocean Sciences priorities document. And it's a 10-year document. It's coming under review or refresh at the moment. I would point out that Māori representation in that is lacking. But again, okay. But what I would say is that the Statement of Intent in 2019-2023, which is the Antarctic New Zealand sort of guiding document, does start to make some really clear representations of the importance. It recognises the importance of Mātauranga Māori and also puts a priority on building relationships with Māori communities or representative bodies, and is making some headway in that space very, very recently. And Fire Sandy, you probably can talk to that at the end. Hi. So in terms of our conversation so far through this seminar series, it's been quite illuminating to me. So if we were to say, okay, where is the Māori voice and representation in this diagram? I think Jack made it pretty clear that Māori participate in fishing in the Southern Ocean quite clearly, and Whaisani indicated Ngāi Tahu have interest down there, or participate down there quite strongly. And when we were talking the other day in Dan's kōrero, it became really apparent, and I think Scylla, you pointed out, that Māori scientists operate in this sphere quite prominently, actually, to what we were thinking previously. And hopefully we can put a list of Māori scientists up on the website just so that people can see the diversity that does exist there. So we're starting to get a picture of where the Māori voice and representation sort of does sit in what currently exists. The next question to think about is like, where can we enhance it? Or how should we enhance it? So you might sort of start talking about, well, we need Māori representation on these governance groups. Will that be effective? We need Māori representation in these delegations. Perhaps Hapua and Iwi can just make representation outside of these existing structures. Perhaps building relationships with other Indigenous peoples internationally is the way to go. Yeah, so there's these lots of different options, and I think the conversation the other day went a little bit in this direction, starting to reimagine our association with Antarctica more holistically through Indigenous worldviews. All right, so in terms of trying to support that conversation, we're taking this approach of, well, what's the best practice around the globe? So we can start looking at other models where Indigenous voices and peoples are making representation in this environmental science, policy and governance. Yeah, and so one example of that is in the Arctic. So this is where Bella sort of comes in. So the Arctic Council is often referred to as being really progressive in terms of its Indigenous voice. But a cool paper came out last year by Medby, I think, pretty sure it was last year, talking about what she refers to as the statization of the Indigenous voice. And that's quite a cool concept to start thinking about. And what they're referring to is that while these 6 heavy-hitting international Indigenous representative bodies do sit on the Arctic Council, they're only there as permanent participants and don't actually have voting rights. So any sort of influence of their voice or authority in their voice needs to be negotiated through the states that do have voting rights on the council. And I think that's a really important distinction. Yeah, so if I have to negotiate my influence through your authority on these governance structures, that's a very different story to me negotiating my influence through my voting authority. All right, so that's just one example, and Bella will be bringing all of that literature together and bringing, I guess, a much more focused sort of research question to her own little kaupapa as well. That's more relevant to her specifically. Drawing on my work history in South Australia, we want to start looking at how Indigenous voice is built into water policy and planning across the Murray-Darling Basin. I guess the thing to point out here, or a couple of things, is that the Murray-Darling Basin is huge. I think it's probably bigger than New Zealand, yeah. And it crosses multiple jurisdictions in terms of Queensland, New South Wales, Canberra's in there, Victoria and South Australia. So it's this basin wide, these ideas of connectedness across this landscape aren't necessarily reflected again in these state borders. Unfortunately though, water is managed and its use is managed at the level of the state. So this became a real issue in the Millennium Drought, and that sort of triggered the establishment of the Murray-Darling Basin, the Basin Plan, yeah. And one of the requirements of that Basin Plan is sort of this document that sits over at the federal level and forces the states to sort of operate on some sort of, not equity, but parity with each other. It builds a standard across the states because what we were seeing that if people used water too heavily and we're still seeing it actually, if people use water too heavily up in these states, then South Australia in particular really suffers. And I'm not sure how much of the news New Zealand has gotten about this, but we've seen some massive fish kills in Wilcannia and Broken Hill fairly recently in the last couple of years that are really indicative of this. You know, our science and understanding of this landscape is not necessarily working, in terms of managing it. So this federal sort of impetus for each of these states to improve their water policy and planning includes a requirement for them to engage with First Nations within the state who have interest in these water, interest in water. And I think the beauty of this example is that while each of the states has done that and is sort of progressively going through finishing their water plans, what we see is that because of the federal requirement, there's a process built into it for First Nations to actually comment on how their values were, how each state had regard to their values and uses of water. And so in that process, we have a really clear indication of whether those policy responses are actually reflective of Indigenous perspectives. And obviously there's lots of examples within Aotearoa, and I think that's where the conversation was heading the other day. I'm going to wrap up very quickly. We've got Te Urewera Act. Dan started talking about that. It's a really cool model that not only does it sort of talk about Māori perspective of connection and start to build that into policy, it really demonstrates a good process for stepping over, a changing over from changing over of control to being iwi-led. Te Awatupu Act, very recent, somebody mentioned it the other day. I think we'll start to see the outcomes of that approach as we go. Taranaki's under, I'm not too sure what's going on there just at the moment, but that would be really interesting to see. But there's lots and lots of other sort of co-management arrangements across Aotearoa that we can draw lessons from of what's the best approach to design this. And I think the other thing that we probably need to start thinking about is what is this bigger picture? So I've sort of, this is just my breakdown of the conversations that we've been having. And I wanted to put it up there just to float the idea and maybe stimulate conversation. But I think there's a couple of themes, research themes that we've identified throughout the seminar series and before. So we've got this sort of the Te Tiriti focus. And there's a question that sits under that, what might an equitable relationship between iwi and the Crown look like in relation to Antarctica? We've got this whakapapa theme, and I think that's been very prominent in our conversations. How do iwi and hapu whakapapa to Antarctica? Going to be lots of different types of conversations there. Kaitiakitanga, I think Crystal just hit the nail on the head with that this morning. How do we go about extrapolating the concept of kaitiakitanga to Antarctica? It's a shared space with no Indigenous peoples, and we need to start thinking about what that might look like. Now that's a big conversation, I think, to be had, especially if we're trying to think about how that gets built into policy and governance. So kotahitanga, I think, how could we come together with other nations and other Indigenous peoples to enact kaitiakitanga in Antarctica? And then this concept of rangatiratanga, how do we ensure an authoritative and well-informed Māori voice in Antarctic decision-making? So where does the Māori voice and representation need to be built into those structures? I think we've seen some really awesome progress very recently with Antarctica, New Zealand, starting to represent it in their policy, but also in terms of recently building those relationships with Kahui Māori, which is, I'm pretty sure, Whaia Sandy, you chair that still. So that's really good progress we're seeing recently. It would just be really cool to see where we can take it in the future. All right, so I think that's the end of my presentation. Oh, have I stopped sharing? All right, so we've got a bit of chat going on.
Yeah, kia ora, Billy, for that. Kia ora for that awesome presentation. You know, sometimes it seems a bit dry until you start thinking about how we can insert ourselves into those conversations, and then of course it gets a lot more interesting. So people have made some great comments in the chat about the NGOs that play a key role at the meetings. So there may be opportunities for Māori within the NGOs. So that's absolutely right. So I guess one of the questions then might be, is that the appropriate place for Māori to have a voice within Antarctic governance?
Absolutely, and that's the sort of conversation that we want to, look at these best practice models. Lots of people have been doing this in lots of different ways around the world, and there's lessons that we can take from them. I'm guessing that ASOC, IUCN would have models operating around the world also, so maybe there's opportunities to learn from them as well. I guess, that Medby paper really does stick in my mind, and that concept of the statisation of the Indigenous voice is a profound thing that you obviously want to avoid.
So there's another comment here about Antarctica, New Zealand being governed by a board of 5 to 7 directors that are appointed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs to provide strategic direction to maintain and enhance the quality of New Zealand Antarctic research. So there are 2 places vacant. This is from Peter Barrett. 2 more may become vacant at the end of 2020. So there's possibility there for Māori representation as well. So remembering Antarctica, New Zealand is responsible for logistics in terms of Antarctica. Yeah,
that's cool to know. I think those sorts of opportunities you need to jump on when you can. I don't know, is Fire Sandy still on board?
Well, I was actually going to ask Bella whether she might have some comments around what works really well in the Arctic for peoples in Alaska, or what doesn't work, because you've had quite a long experience of being involved in governance and management, and I know not all of it's been particularly successful.
Yeah, so kind of along the lines of what Billy was saying, like at an international level, the fact that the 6 permanent participants don't have voting rights is a very big problem. But the way that research involves Indigenous voices in the Arctic definitely happens at a lot of different stages. So we have like a local stage, which is like community-led observations that coordinate with researchers or bigger organizations to not only help research projects, but to create things such as like the Sea for Ice Walrus Outlook, which is like a resource for Arctic hunters that the federal government like helps them with to ensure that they are safer when they're out on the ice due to like changing conditions. Then at like a state level, you have the 13 regional Alaska Native corporations. So the way that Alaska Native Settlement Claims Act worked was that basically the land is allotted to these different ANCs, which are non-for-profit, and they control all of the lands and oversee and advise development. So basically, let's say like a researcher comes in and wants to do research on native lands, they can't do anything unless the native corporation allows it or is like the one in charge of the actual research itself. So the fact that like Alaska Natives have 12% of the area of Alaska in land use like is a big factor into research, because it's like a huge part of Alaska is owned by Alaska Natives. And then at the national level in the US, the main way that the Arctic is kind of overseen is through the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which at any given time, 1 out of the 7 commissioners has to be an Indigenous resident from the Arctic. And so the U.S. Arctic Research Commission develops and recommends a national Arctic research policy. So there's a lot of different levels of Indigenous influence, and I definitely think the international level is one that needs a lot of work, considering the voting rights for the permanent participants. But as of right now, I think that the main things that are happening is a lot of like local communities are starting to kind of like get more involved in that way as well, which has been pretty cool to see happen. So yeah, there's.
Yeah, cool. Actually, Bella, I just wanted to draw on some of the conversations we've been having in terms of, this international perspective. So for Athabascan, the salmon run is quite a prominent part of culture, and that sort of idea of connectedness across the Alaskan and Canadian border is something that doesn't really match with what we know in terms of connectedness to place and to these non-human species. Did you have any sort of inclination as to how different the Alaskan and Canadian Athabascan voice sort of comes out?
Yeah, so in talking about like subsistence rights, is that what you're saying when it comes to like fishing? Yeah, Alaska and Canada have very different like regulations when it comes to subsistence, which is interesting because it's on the exact same river. The Yukon flows through Alaska into Canada through the border, and it's when we have salmon runs, which is every year. And I was just up on the Yukon a couple of weeks ago for the salmon run. We have to like allow a certain amount of fish to get through because then they have to go to Canada. But basically the way that subsistence is controlled in Alaska is basically like kind of void of a native voice, if that makes sense, because due to this act called a NILCA, all subsistence is regardless of whether or not you're native or you're non-native. So basically when it comes to fishing, natives in Alaska don't get like special subsistence rights. They get the same rights as every other person in Alaska who is a subsistence liver. So that means like you depend on this fish for your like well-being and for your food security. Whereas in Canada, that's not the way that it is. It is based off of like whether you are native or you're non-native, which has definitely been like a big contentious point in Alaska, just given that subsistence like is culture, and the fact that Alaska natives don't have like a special pass for subsistence, even though Canada does on the exact same river, is definitely something that kind of shows what's going on between borders and stuff.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I guess I really am quite excited. It probably sounds really boring to everyone else, but just to have a look at how different people, different Indigenous peoples go about building their voices, worldviews and knowledges into environmental science policy and governance around the world is, I think, quite fascinating. It's the politics of how they're negotiated and the social and environmental outcomes that you do actually get from them. So for some of them, they're quite new. And it's probably a bit of an onerous, it's a bit of a big ask to start thinking, was that effective? Was that effective? But, there's a lot to be learned about those that sort of have been kicking around for a while. And I think Dan really brought that out the other day in the discussion when he started talking about Ecuador and the rights of Pachamama, these different sort of approaches to building Indigenous worldviews and epistemologies into our governance and policy structures, I think is quite prominent. And I think I wouldn't mind picking up a conversation with Alan Hemmings. I can see you're on there, Alan. That conversation where we started thinking about, well, how do we represent these ideas of connectedness to place in Antarctica on that international scale? So what we're talking very national level here. I think that's been our focus. But thinking about it on that international level is quite another beast that I don't think I've necessarily thrown my head at quite enough. Yeah. All right. So we're running close to time. Silly, you're muted, mate.
Okay, I've got another question for Bella while you're throwing your head around. Someone would like to know how things work in the Russian part. Don't know if you've got any information on that or not, Bella, but
so I just started this research a couple weeks ago because I spend the first part of my summer up on the Yukon River where we don't have cell phone service or Wi-Fi, so I haven't quite gotten to Russia yet in terms of research, but it will be something I'll be probably looking into as the paper goes on.
Silly, you're muted again, but
It's all right. It's all right. Is there any other questions? Does anybody have any further questions for Billy? We've sort of got 5 minutes really to wrap it up. But just a reminder as well that you may want to go and talk about some of these issues with the whānau. You may want to come back and watch the seminar again to or actually go to the webpage. It's full of lots of links and gives you a really good idea about what's happening in Antarctic governance and management now. So that's a great starting point if you're thinking about where you or your hapu or your iwi might want to contribute, or if they would like to take a position. So please do check out all the resources, or email us through the website as well if you've got questions. So that online wānanga for whānau and hapu and iwi is August the 12th. But also there's a survey, so if you'd like to contribute thoughts that way, you can do both. Either in writing or come along and raise your voice that way. So there's another thing in the chat, which is great.
Would like me to respond as well?
Yeah, that would be great.
Did you want to do the chat or me first?
I'll do the chat first. So Peter's saying there's the slow pace of the 2020-2030 Antarctic science strategy is a current issue for MFAT and Antarctica New Zealand. And so Peter's happy to follow up with Billy on that. But it sounds as though there's work going on, but perhaps not as fast as...
my understanding through my conversations, it seems like it's been, definitely it's taking a long time, which these things all do. And I guess, I think there's more chat about it being a refresh rather than a full review. But yeah, I'm happy to follow up with you, Peter. I'll come upstairs.
Okay, Sandy, did you have a few thoughts that you'd like to add to the discussion?
Well, it was firstly with Billy making reference to some of the work that we're doing, but before doing that, kanuinga mahi ki a koe, Billy, nā we whakatoi o whakaaro kei mua. So thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation, and to Bella for her responses as well. So just a couple of points is, I don't know if people know, but the Kāhui, the Antarctic Science Platform, has now appointed a Kāhui Māori, of which I chair. And I also don't want to forget that we carry a dual Kāhui role, because we're also Kāhui for the Deep South Challenge, Changing with Our Climate. So our focus and our vision, particularly for the Deep South, is to be able to allow and enable New Zealanders to adapt, manage risk and thrive in a changing climate environment. And for the Antarctic Science Platform, there's an explicit vision on the value of mātauranga Māori to Antarctic science, and therefore the need to engage. So there's really no dispute about that. The next job, both with the Deep South Challenge, for which we've been working for 5-6 years now, we're certainly working to incorporate a very strong vision mātauranga policy throughout all levels, and that's the work that we'll be doing with the Antarctic Science Platform as well. And so I think it's the explicit vision at the end that we need to concentrate on. So when we talk about whānau and hapu representation, to do what and what for, and what is the accountability back to hapu and iwi, because we're still very tribal and we're still very collective. And that there's also the respect that needs to be negotiated with Ngāi Tahu, who for thousands of years have been fishing down in that area. And I think, you know, a couple of things like the map and the operational logistic relationships that you showed are through agencies operating. Our relationships with whānau and hapu are different.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
many ways we need to be able to sort out who is in the Māori space. And it's not just the Antarctica, because we shouldn't have those divisions, because it's the land, but it's the ocean as well. If we're to stay committed to that application of Te Tai-ao, then there's no separation. And then there's also the sub-Antarctic experience, you know. So it's kind of, how do Māori want to work together, and what's going to be realistic in achieving aspiration, so that we are clear about what can be managed and what cannot be managed. So yeah, just to reiterate again that we have a very firm mandate to ensure that the work that is done is relevant and beneficial for Māori communities to be able to set their own adaptation and mitigation strategies. And even before us, you know, there's been a number of other works and papers that have come out advocating for Māori representation. So I go back to our whanaunga Turi McFarlane's paper that was coming through, Michael Stevens as well. So just want to acknowledge that. Thanks very much.
Kia ora. Cool. We're running out of time. We're pushing on the hour now. So sorry about that. I think I presented for way too long. Thank you, Sandy, for your kōrero. Really important, I think, to really think about. That's the sort of structure that we're working with in terms of Antarctic science policy and governance, but how do hapu and iwi actually work together? That's a really cool whakaaro to build in here. So there's a bit of chat still coming through, but I think we're going to have to follow up with you a bit later, guys. So we might just close the seminar and the series there, and thank everybody for your participation. It's been really, really cool. Please engage in this kaupapa through the website. There's lots of avenues for people to become involved, and we're really keen to see how people, different iwi, hapu, see themselves getting involved in the future. All right, so I might leave that there, and we'll finish with karakia and call it a close. Did you want to say anything, Scylla, just quickly?
No, I think, you know, as they say, the kai o te rangatira, or te kai a te rangatira, it's kōrero, right? And I think I'll certainly be leaving with a lot of whakaaro and a lot of things to think about. So yeah, he mihi nui ki a koe, Billy. Thank you for this, and to Bella as well for these this last seminar, and thank you for doing such a beautiful job. So yeah, kia koe.
Thank you. All right. Unihia te ki te uru tapunui. Kia wātea, kia māma te ngākau. Te tinana, te wairawa I te ara takatā. Ko ia rai rongo, whakairia ake ki runga. Kia tina, hui e, tai ki e.
Yeah.
Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Billy. Thank you everyone for coming.